The next generation of video games are here. Isn't that amazing? Oh, just think of all the fun we're going to have in this generation now. Oh, wow. Wow, isn't it so amazing? It's just like the adverts said it would be. Oh, wow. Oh, more microtransactions. Oh, more stuff being removed to be sold as DLC. That's... okay. Oh, sandboxes, yay! Yay! Well, at least we've got some more indie games to look forward to. Oh, but on the whole, it's kind of going to be the same. It's the same as it ever was. 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 The same as it ever was.
Hello Internet, I'm from the Internet and my name is Mr. Mad. What pixel reality are we serving up this time? Well, we're looking at the circle of gaming, how the introduction of VAR into Rocket League is already proving controversial.
Just don't understand the logic, I don't understand what they've done. Gutted.
What's this? But first,
the video games have been going on for a long while now, haven't they? But we're entering into a brand new, shiny generation where all these new graphics and new words are going to be buzzing around us, and they're just going to be drilled into our heads by marketing teams until we're absolutely sick of them. But this is just another part of the cycle. And what do I mean by a cycle? Do I mean a console generation cycle, or do I mean a cycle sim? Well, to end up figuring out what I mean by this, we need to look back a bit. So let's go backwards, shall we?
video games have been bubbling away since the 1940s, with the earliest being based around analog principles linked to TV screens, usually oscilloscopes connected up directly to a cathode ray TV. These basic systems were a single program, so were fast loading, although they could have some quirks from warming up. But this wasn't a true computer program. The first true video game program was from some Alan Turing and David Champernowne chaps.
It was a chess sim called Turo Champ, which was created in 1948. It was truly ahead of its time, in that it couldn't actually be run on any of the systems at the time. Turing ended up coming back to it later on to test it on later machines, but it couldn't really end up running on those either. It couldn't pass a test. I suppose we could end up calling it a Turing test.
If we skip ahead a little to when video games began to appear more in the 1950s, games such as Tic-Tac-Toes and Mouse in the Maze allowed inputs to control the action, but these were on dedicated hardware. In the 1960s, development continued until Magnavox released the Odyssey in 1972.
With Odyssey, the electronic game of the future, and the family's best foul-weather friend.
This isn't quite the same as what we now know as a home console. Other systems in this time typically had the game or games built in. These early steps displayed that games could be instantly loaded, some with additional accessories such as physical cards, dice and playing boards.
This was known as the first generation of video games, and it was not that great really. It doesn't deserve the same high praise as say vinyl records, as we can end up looking back and using those now still and seeing benefits to those, whilst with a lot of these original video game consoles and games there isn't really the same level. Zipping around the timeline. During World War II, the need to have instructions easily movable between different computers ended up becoming of vital importance. This is due to the fact that the machines could end up being damaged, or that they might need to end up moving the code from one place to another. The side effect of this, of course, is that we could end up having code that would be transportable between multiple machines, or to end up being able to make the machines that we had have different purposes based on what was installed on them. Try to think of it as, say, like the Tiger Electronics handheld games that you can end up getting versus a Game Boy with loads of different cartridges.
Because of this development and being able to store a computer program separate from the system itself, additional programs could be sold and developed after the release of the initial hardware later, when storage mediums could be made more consumer-friendly.
Generation 2 systems typically ended up using cartridges to store their data. Systems such as the Fairchild Channel F, the Vectrex, and the mighty Atari 2600 all ended up being really popular around this time. The major appeal for home consumers was being able to end up playing arcade titles at home. They might not look exactly the same as the arcade counterparts, but at least they were playable, allowing people to get some practice, or just to end up being able to end up having a little bit of entertainment whilst everything, pre-internet didn't exist. Developers ended up flourishing under this system, being able to release so many fantastic titles. But then we started to end up having a few dodgy titles. And obviously, a few dodgy titles can't end up spoiling the whole bunch, especially nothing, like E.T.
Meanwhile,
Another side was building up, the home computer market.
Whilst the home console market was building up to massive stakes, the home computer market was also taking huge strides. Commodore, Acorn, Amstrad and Apple created computers that either could plug into dedicated monitors or your home TV, with a focus more on applications rather than games.
Although games were definitely a huge part of it.
These home computers tended to have more beef under the hood than home consoles, but required a little bit more to get going rather than just being a plug-and-play solution, using cartridges, diskettes and cassettes to store games and data.
Tell me, if I was to stick my fingers into the disk drive when the red light is on, would my fingers get loaded into the computer's memory too?
On the home console side, we had that bubble that I alluded to earlier with E.T. finally burst, meaning that a lot of titles that were released were just buried by an overindulgence of awful titles, mass-produced, and ended up taking up too much shelf space, so eventually retailers tried to end up sending them back. As a result, the entire market ended up crashing horrifically. Now, home computers ended up surviving this crash because of the fact they ended up being slightly more multi-purpose.
So what happens next? Well, on the console side of things, a toy and card company called Nintendo created a new console called the Famicom in Japan in 1983, which faded into obscurity and did nothing. I kid.
A battle to rescue the Mushroom Princess from the evil Koopa Turtles. Go for the joystick for extra control, or go to infrared for remote control. The hottest games are on Nintendo, the world's #1 game system.
It came out in the USA as the NES in 1985 and Europe as the NES in 1986. It's strange how translation can change things, eh? On July 15th, 1983, another company released their big console. Sega pumped out the SG-1000.
Sega Monaco Grand Prix.
Now, one of the things that people get wrong is that the SG-1000 was kind of the Master System. It was actually an early version of it. Like potato waffles are just early versions of smiley faces.
There were some other systems in the third generation of video games, other than just the ones from Nintendo and Sega. However, Nintendo basically ended up dominating the market. It ended up shifting everything over from what was mainly PC-centric over to the consoles again, in a shift we will never see repeated again. Consoles tended to run off of cartridges and things were pretty grand. You ended up popping a cartridge in, turn on the switch, and boom! The game had basically already loaded. Well, of course, you also ended up having to toggle a little RF switch, make sure that it was on the right channel, and sometimes just tune the frequency a little bit because someone had nudged the TV ever so slightly. A minor gripe, but the load times really were. On the home computer side, we're about to see a bit of a shift. Obviously the business applications have still been going pretty strong, and of course there were still games that were coming out for home computers. However, things were starting to change a little bit. With the prevalence of the disk operating system, or DOS, we ended up seeing more games released for that one platform, the operating system. So if you ended up having a DOS game, it would run on any version of DOS, with some provisos. DOS ended up being the thing that ended up tying the hardware and the software together. This ended up being the platform that most games were being played on the PC side of things. When the cost started coming down for home computers, they ended up becoming more prevalent in people's homes.
Gaming on PC had a huge boost from DOS, and the publishers moving from the home computers of old to the DOS systems of current. Floppy disks tended to be the most popular way of getting things running, so they had load times.
Games could get more complex, taking advantage of the more advanced aspects of the personal computer, so things were starting to really rev up in the PC space.
Microsoft MS-DOS 5 upgrade training. This is the first time MS-DOS has been available as an upgrade. It's new.
But of course, Sega and Nintendo were building up for a follow-up, a 16-bit follow-up. In 1988, Sega ended up releasing the Mega Drive, which for some bizarre reason ended up having this weird translation issue when it ended up finally arriving over in America. It ended up being retranslated as the Genesis, or Genesis. It was a very odd thing. We over in Europe obviously ended up still having it as the Mega Drive. It brought some amazing improvements both in the visuals and also in the audio, with the Yamaha sound processor being an absolutely amazing add-on, giving a real distinctive feel to a lot of the games that were released on the Mega Drive. Nintendo followed suit in 1990 in Japan by releasing the Super Famicom, and are we really doing this again? Like, really? Are we really doing this again? Look, okay, it's right, the last translation, like, joke. We're making the last translation joke. Okay, right, so, right. In 1991, it arrived on American shores as the SNES, whilst over here in Europe, it ended up arriving in 1992 as the SNES. Both of these systems ended up having huge advantages over their predecessors, both in the graphics and the sound design, along with new fancy add-ons that could be put onto each system, and also cartridges that ended up taking advantage of custom chips directly on them. But a new format was coming, one that would change storage for all systems at the time: CDs.
PCs started seeing CD-ROMs become more widely available after being developed in 1972 and slowly becoming more refined in the 1980s, with the biggest change in 1984 as Sony and Denon created the CD-ROM format to permit storage of any data. Games saw the biggest boost to this on the CD side, with the ability to have videos pop up as intro sequences, cutscenes, and also better music from CD streaming. Another big boost was games having a lot more space to play with, 1.44 megabytes on a floppy disk versus 750 megabytes on a CD. Less disk swapping for an install being one of the biggest pluses on a pain in the arse perspective. Of course, consoles had to get in on the action, some being add-ons such as the Mega CD in 1991, 1992 or 1993 depending where you lived, or dedicated consoles such as the Neo Geo CD or the phenomenal Philips CDI in 1991.
If you're wondering what Nintendo were doing during all of this, they didn't really get into the add-in market. They ended up having a cartridge which allowed you to play Game Boy games on your TV through your SNES, because basically it contained an actual Game Boy inside of it.
But Nintendo did almost join forces with another company. Around 1991, Nintendo were approached by Sony to propose a
mighty team-up.
Ken Kutaragi was interested in video games after seeing his daughter playing a Famicom, so proposed to Sony to develop a partnership with Nintendo. This resulted in the audio subsystem for the SNES and a building development between the two companies. Eventually, this became an agreement to develop an add-on for the SNES to give the console a CD-ROM, or rather Super Disc, and Sony to develop an all-in-one system that had SNES support and Super Disc support.
But Sony did something absolutely shocking. They took control of the Super Disc format and also the audio chip that was in the SNES, and ended up having a dev kit tool that only they would end up providing. As a result, Nintendo were a little bit shocked at the fact that they would be doing something that they would do themselves, and as a result they were looking to try and work their way around this partnership.
Nintendo decided to start chatting up another CD company behind Sony's back in a way that would make Reddit's AITAH group have a field day. Philips came onto the scene to develop a new audio chip and CD-ROM add-on. More on Nintendo's terms, but Philips could leverage Nintendo's properties for their own games.
So how did this partnership between Nintendo and Philips go? Well, not well. Nintendo decided to drop the CD-ROM add-on completely, and Philips decided that they were going to end up creating their own CD-ROM based game system. They ended up having the previous agreement with Nintendo, which meant that they could use Nintendo's characters in their own games, and let's just see how those look.
Enough. My ship sails in the morning. I wonder what's for dinner.
Oh boy! I'm so hungry, I could eat an octorok!
I hope she made lots of spaghetti. You know what they say, all toasters toast toast. Princess!
Oh!
What happened?
Nothing, Link. We were just about to have a feast.
Great!
And you gotta help us. Lots of spaghetti, lots of spaghetti, lots of spaghetti.
Lots of spaghetti. Lots of spaghetti.
Whew. Well, at least there's the memes that came out of them. Sony, previously not that interested in creating their own video game console, have now ended up being spurned by Nintendo, you know, the biggest guys in the industry, and they were hurt. And they decided that they were going to end up trying to do it themselves. Well, they've already created a lot of the stuff that was going to become the SNES PlayStation, so why not drop the SNES out of it? Why not create just a PlayStation? I mean, how could that go?
I'd like to talk to you about a menace, threatening humanity. It's happening right here, in our very homes, and corrupting the lives of our loved ones. Yes, friends, I'm talking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut.
With the 16-bit generation coming to an end, and Sony getting into the race themselves with PlayStation, the future was obviously going to be disc-based. So many discs, big, lovely, shiny discs. Sony ended up having their own discs that were slightly different to CD-ROMs in that they ended up having a black layer. They also ended up having a little bit of a wobble on them, but that was for protection reasons. Sega ended up having CD-ROMs on their own platform, the Sega Saturn. However, things were a little bit different over there. We'll end up getting onto that. And Nintendo. Nintendo ended up going with cartridges again on the Nintendo 64.
ソニーほどの会社がプレイステーションの発売にあたって本当に何百万ドルのものお金を使うとお思いになりますか？しかもこんなサックなゲームにサクビクタイム嫌ですホーミー母親は悪い子は決して褒めませんソニーはナムコを選びましたナムコの新しいゲームは決してサックなんかじゃありませんサッキングなんてことはもってのほかですソニーはプレイステーションの発売と同時にナムコのタイトルも一緒に選びましたそうちょうどリッジレースのようなタイトルを選びましたちょっと誰かリッジレーサーのビデオお願い
Now, this is where a slight shift starts to take place. With developers making or breaking systems more, Nintendo had this 5th generation in a bit of a weird place. Going with cartridges on the Nintendo 64 meant that they had a lot more control over what was released, also resulted in higher costs for developers and lower capacity for storage. While Sega were on the right track using discs, but had a difficult architecture to develop for, meaning that whilst getting the plastic out to the customers was alright, getting the Cody bits to play nice was more difficult.
Sony, however, struck onto a fantastic idea: make development as easy as possible and make production as cheap as possible. They could end up getting games released a lot faster and a lot cheaper on the PlayStation than any other platform. This meant that more developers could take a punt on releasing some weird and quirky titles, and more games could be released for their platform, resulting in hundreds and hundreds of games being released for the Sony PlayStation. The difference between this and the previous crash that we ended up seeing in Generation 2 in the 80s is that due to the production costs being a lot less and the actual cases and games themselves being smaller, it meant that shops didn't have to get filled up as much. Along with this, there was the burgeoning online scene where people could purchase games directly from retailers or the publishers, and it just made things a lot easier. There was still some worries, but it wasn't going to be as bad as the previous big crashes.
On the PC side, CD-ROMs were all the rage, along with the Windows operating system slowly usurping DOS as the launcher of choice, especially as games began leveraging Windows enhancements and resources. Especially Windows became the de facto platform for PC players to get onto their games. Of course, you could still try and run stuff on other operating systems such as OS2 or Linux, but yeah, good luck.
So what is the downside between switching from cartridges to discs? Well, load times really. As we ended up switching onto discs, we ended up seeing load times creeping up. Some of them just gave you a load bar, some of them would end up giving you a cheeky loading screen, and others would just sort of give you nothing, just a pause. So these new pauses in action ended up becoming more and more commonplace, and it just became accepted by gamers that this was the new norm. Let's advance to the next big change. CDs moving on to a little known versatile format. A digital versatile format.
Digital versatile discs, or DVDs, or even DVDs, brought a huge amount of space to consoles and PCs. Around 1995, the format was finalised and slowly manufacturers could release dedicated players for movies and drives for PCs in 1997, with the first drive being released by Creative Labs. Obviously, one of the big advantages for PC players was the increased capacity, meaning that a funny problem that reappeared could be removed. Multi-CD-ROM games bring that retro flair from multi-floppy games. One of the first titles was Wing Commander 3, bringing all the discs onto one DVD-ROM. That 4.7 gigabytes, getting a nice workout.
Along with this, graphics cards were becoming more prevalent, with Nvidia, AMD and 3DFX all releasing cards which ended up enhancing PCs. Since they could end up being swapped out for a new card, it meant that you could end up having a little bit of a boost for your money. You didn't have to throw out the whole system, you could just end up switching out the graphics card and boom, you ended up having a big boost to your system. On the console side, Sega, after having a bit of a beating with the Sega Saturn, released their follow-up, the Sega Dreamcast. This featured 4 controller ports for some fantastic offline play, as well as online play via the first inbuilt console modem. This allowed players to end up connecting online and to be able to end up playing against people all over the world. Whilst it didn't use DVDs, it used its own enhanced CD format known as GD-ROM.
Hey buddy. Hey, yeah you, wanna play a game? Oh no, this isn't a Saw thing. This was supposed to be a segue into a bit about multiplayer.
Video games usually ended up having support for additional players via either having an additional ports on the console itself, or ports on the actual controller, or you could end up having one person on a keyboard and the other on a joystick, or you could end up having the most exciting action of 2 people, 1 keyboard.
This was pretty steady, with systems coming usually with 2 ports for controllers, co-op and versus modes. In some special instances, cartridges came with an additional 2 ports, such as Micro Machines having ports on the cart itself, or in the case of the PlayStation, a multi-tap to have 4 pads shoved into one socket. Machines such as the Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast featuring 4 ports from the get-go for that local multi-madness.
On the PC side, connecting independent systems all together ended up becoming very, very popular with LAN parties, where people would end up getting together with cheeky pizzas or a couple of cheeky beers, along with showing off their lovely beige cases. And then the internet came along.
Everything changed as the internet became more and more accessible. Online multiplayer became possible for people on the PC space. Eventually the Dreamcast would bring this to the home space on consoles, giving players the ability to play against or with others all over the internet, on games such as Phantasy Star Online, Choo Choo Rocket, and Worms.
There are a few certainties in this universe, but a PC or a console getting Worms is one of the few certainties.
The major limitation in this time was having a dedicated line for this online play, along with speeds being slow. Well, in comparison to today's standards.
In the year 2000, Sony released the PlayStation 2. This was probably one of the most significant video game console launches of all time, because it ended up allowing you to play DVD movies. Because of this, players not only ended up having a brand new games console, but they also ended up having the new way of playing all the hot new discs, from movies to DVD box sets to random shows that you could end up finding. As well as this, the PlayStation 2 also supported the PlayStation 1 games, so it had full backwards compatibility with the games that you already ended up having, and some people have vast PlayStation 1 libraries, so this was really fantastic. As well as this, having the ability to play DVD movies, all for around 300 quid on launch, is really an incredible value proposition. Considering that a standalone player would have cost about the same, if not slightly more in some cases, this really was one of the best value propositions in all of gaming, and maybe in a lot of consumer electronics.
But what did Nintendo do during this time? After not doing so great with the Nintendo 64, they decided to start following the herd and switch to discs. DVD ones. But mini ones, so they didn't have as much storage space. The GameCube, released in 2001, was basically the Ron Seal of consoles. It did what it said on the tin. It was a cube that played games. It did see internet connectivity, but that wasn't a big priority for Nintendo, and few titles supported it. A few more supported LAN play, but trying to find enough people with the specific parts needed was painful.
All this talk of retro gaming has really made me want to just dig out some of those old consoles. It's really given me a hankering for some classic gaming. Let's dig out one of the old consoles and give it a little whirl, shall we? I've got one right here. Let's go! Ooh, looking forward to playing some GameCube. Let's try and plug this in now. Oh dearie me, it looks like we can't plug the GameCube into the modern display. It doesn't end up having the required inputs. But what are your options if you actually want to end up plugging in a lot of these old systems into your new TV? Well, there's upscalers and converters and things like that, but how do you know if they're any good? Well, my recommendation to you would be to check out Retro RGB, the fantastic channel that ends up going over a lot of these old systems and how to end up hooking them up to modern displays, as well as talking about things such as the open source scan converter and the FrameMeister. Along with this, there's also My Life in Gaming, which I would heavily recommend as a look over a lot of these old systems and how they end up being compatible with the modern world. There's also the FPGA route. FPGA stands for Field Programmable Gate Array. This ends up emulating the old systems down to the circuit level. It's an amazing way to end up having basically hardware accurate systems which are in a smaller form factor and with HDMI and other modern outputs. The best one I can think of is the Mega SG, which is from Analog. This allows you to play Mega Drive games in a very, very tiny little micro Mega Drive and ends up being almost completely accurate to the original systems. It allows you to end up using a lot of your old accessories if they're able to be plugged in, and it ends up having a sneaky firmware which will allow you to end up expanding its capabilities. A lot of these systems I would heavily recommend you check out, as well as My Life in Gaming and Retro RGB, to end up finding out about your retro needs in this modern world. There's of course the final option which is available to you, which is the purchase of a CRT TV, which will make you remember how bloody big the things were.
One thing that I haven't touched on yet is backwards compatibility. The ability to play previous generation games was a selling point for consoles. Why re-buy a ton of games when you can just bring your library with you? The Atari 5200 was one of the earliest examples using an adapter to permit using 2600 cartridges. The Mega Drive could use Master System games using the power-based converter. Sony had an on-off relationship with backwards compatibility. On the PC side, it's been fairly easy, but some things can be interesting with running older games on newer systems. Microsoft have been pretty solid with backwards compatibility, with only a few things left out of the compatibility list, such as bring that back, cowards. I want that auto HDR on that game now.
Come on then, right.
The Dreamcast didn't do as well as Sega hoped, and as a result they ended up finally leaving the hardware space after all of the years that they ended up putting into video game consoles and video games themselves as a first party publisher and developer. The innovations that the Dreamcast ended up bringing on, such as the visual memory unit and Seaman, would end up being lost to time. From the bones of the Dreamcast came a new player, one that was not so familiar to the console side of things, unless they looked on the front of the Dreamcast already. Microsoft had entered the battle. The Xbox was released by Microsoft in 2001 and ended up seeing them bring elements of the PC over into the home console market. The idea of the system was it was supposed to be a PC that you could end up hooking up to your TV. Well, at least that was how it was originally pitched to get past the green light stage. In reality, it ended up being its own dedicated platform, separate from PCs but with a similar architecture, so developers could bring things over directly to Microsoft's Xbox as easily as they could.
Humans, you have a natural gift for playing. Don't lose it. Work less, play more.
Half-Life was one of the most important games in PC gaming, becoming one of the defining titles in visual presentation, not just in action but in story. But this was released in 1998 and players worldwide were wanting to see what old Gordon Freeman was up to. Well, in 2004 we'd get an answer to that would not only further the work of Half-Life, but also further the relationship between consumer and platform.
Half-Life 2 was released in a slightly different fashion to what PC players were used to. You could still get a retail copy of the game, however you needed an online activator to actually get it going. To end up doing this, you'd need to install something called Steam. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Half-Life 2 was released in 2004 in a slightly different fashion from what PC players were used to. The physical release required an additional launcher and online activator. Steam. Get it? Valve, Steam. Steam comes from poorly working valves that are under intense stress. Oh, actually, when you think about it, it's more steam bursting from pipes, usually meaning something bad, and you have to muck around with valves just to try and fix it, and now this has gone wildly from what I thought was just a fun wordplay around pipes.
There have been other online activated programs before, but not to the extent that Half-Life 2 was. This was a massive release, and you had to end up being able to connect online to actually get the software activated. If you didn't do that, then no Half-Life 2 for you. No ifs, no buts, no Gordon nuts.
Steam's initial expectation was to activate retail titles, automatically update the titles, and provide anti-cheat measures for online multiplayer games. So Steam was installed on computers to permit people to play the new hotness of smacking things with a crowbar and throwing stuff around with a gravity gun, but really a physics toy. But this opened up a new window for Valve. Why not start selling games through this new mandatory install? A lot of PC players have it on their system, why not update it to sell more games? Valve has some games already, so why not sell them through a digital storefront?
Steam didn't start off as the behemoth it is now. It slowly built up. So this basic activator for Half-Life 2 has now mutated into one of the biggest platforms on the PC gaming side of things. We now end up having a situation where the operating system, then Steam on top, ends up being the way that people end up playing their games. So we now have a situation where we have an operating system and then a distribution platform on top, and this is basically the standard for most players now. Of course you can still get games without a launcher, however most PC users now will end up starting up Windows and seeing Steam pop up, hence the memes.
When people talk about the significance of Half-Life 2 being one of the most important games of all time, they normally talk about its progress in storytelling and gameplay, but I tend to think it's more around Steam's requirement to play. It started the first conversations about game ownership in the digital age, mandatory installation of additional aspects to play a piece of digital entertainment, and gave rise to the platform that would alter the fundamental agreements between publishers, developers and consumers.
2005 marked the new console generation, and that plucky upstart Microsoft didn't see much success with the original Xbox, which means that their next offering, the Xbox 360, is obviously going to get decimated in the next generation.
Microsoft decided to go with a similar idea for the Xbox 360 as the Xbox, similar architecture to the PC, and a focus on online play. However, they refined their systems to have better integration of online features, along with a digital storefront. Gee, I wonder where we saw that. The Xbox 360 launched with a bit of a red light issue. Well, 3 red lights. 3 deadly red lights in a ring. This was a huge issue for Microsoft, and they had to work hard to try and fix this overheating problem, along with attempting to fix the public relations issue. The Xbox 360 evolved over time, adding in features that were missing such as Wi-Fi and USB data storage, instead of proprietary storage, and massively improving the operating system, going from style to style to refresh how it looks and can be interacted with. There was an interesting add-on, one that really connected with people. Of course it was the HD DVD player. Since the other console we're about to talk about supported another format, Microsoft decided to release an add-on that would enable playback of high-definition digital versatile discs, which had some support from movie studios. It did alright, but ultimately didn't catch on, even if it did have a rather fetching red motif. I bring it up because it reminded me of the classic days of having multiple plugs from the Mega Drive. Of course, there is another add-on, but we'll get onto that in just a little bit. Be calm, be patient, just wait. Just wait a little bit.
Sony decided to end up following up the PlayStation 2 with their next system, the PlayStation 3. I'm beginning to spot a pattern here with this. It came out looking like a big shiny bread bin, and had a ton of bells and whistles hidden under the hood. From PlayStation 2 support with actual PlayStation 2 inners in there, playing Blu-ray discs, which the games came on, supporting Super Audio CDs, which were 5.1 surround sound discs, PlayStation 1 games, Linux support, which was a nice feature, albeit not everyone used it, as well as the Magic Gate stuff that Sony was pushing at the time. Sony decided they were going to do something a little bit different. They decided that they were going to go with their own processor, the Cell processor, which is named after the main bad guys in Metal Gear Solid 2. This wasn't easy for developers to get the most out of. When developers were able to end up getting the most out of the Cell processor, they were able to do some really amazing things. But if a developer couldn't really get to grips with it, things went disastrously wrong. A strange thing happened with the PlayStation 3 as time went on. A lot of the features that I ended up listing earlier were cut out of the system to save costs. So SACD support, binned. The PlayStation 2 support, binned. Linux, binned. And then they decided to release one that looked a bit like a McCoy's Crisp on top. It was really odd. Again, there was an add-on for the PlayStation 3, which we're going to get onto. I promise we're going to get onto it. But there was another competitor in this race. One that won this generation handily, if you just look at sales figures. It's outsold like absolute madness, but it wasn't really as well received by hardcore gamers with a Z, and that is of course the Hyperscan. It was the Nintendo Wii, but you knew that. I was just doing a little bit, sorry. Nintendo, continuing on in the Nintendo way, decided to finally ditch the miniature DVDs and actually go with full-size ones this time. But instead of an actual controller, you had a little TV remote with gyros, and don't you know, it actually worked. The Wii was released in 2006, the same year as the PlayStation 3, and sold at the end of its lifetime 101 million units. For reference, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 sold around 80 million units each. It became a cultural phenomenon where everyone could end up playing. Whether it was to use the Wiimote to end up rolling a ball, or playing around with tennis, or just throwing it into your TV screen just to smash it. It also supported GameCube games, which is actually really counter to Nintendo's usual stance on the console side, having full backwards compatibility with the previous generation, allowing you to actually have the discs go straight in, as well as actually having the controller ports on the top of it, and memory card slots. This was a really nice little bonus, because it also meant that the new enhanced screen output could allow you to actually play GameCube games in a slightly better quality than what a lot of people were used to. However, there was a bit of a problem. Whilst the Nintendo Wii and the Xbox 360 shared an architecture, they didn't really end up sharing the same booth. As a result, it meant that when a third-party publisher would end up releasing a game on the Xbox 360 and the Wii, you would end up seeing huge feature set difference, or a huge graphical knock between the Wii version, the Xbox 360 and the PS3 version as well. This ended up meaning that Nintendo Wii owners were falling further and further behind, and Nintendo's platform itself was also falling further and further back. Nintendo have always ended up having this little bit of an issue with online functionality, dating all the way back from the Nintendo DS all the way up to the Wii U. They fixed it a little bit with the next console. But what about the add-ons? On the Microsoft side, you ended up having the Kinect, which could end up seeing parts of your skeleton, and ended up being a really unique experience over what was being offered on the Wii, as well as on Sony's PlayStation Move, which ended up being a stick with a big glowing orb on it. It ended up having some fun things to do on it, but it ended up really hitting its stride on the next platform with the PlayStation VR.
The grim overindulgence of games.
Not every game will be a smash hit. Some of them don't need to be. They just need to reach their target audience and sell enough to make back what was put in, hopefully. However, some developers from around the PlayStation 2 era found that due to the popularity of the platform, they could just shove anything out there and hope it sold regardless of the quality. Most of these came from people selling the idea of having a game on a leading platform to people with money. Venture capitalists, who thanks to someone in a slick suit with a haircut, could get them to invest in their game. As a result, a lot of games of poor quality came out, called lovingly shovelware. Stuff that was mass-produced typically with little focus on the contents of the game. It's basically the same as trash TV. In fact, some of the shovelware titles were based on trash TV. This became a major issue on Steam, where the limiters came off of who could publish a game and charge real money for it. with Steam Greenlight becoming a cesspool of asset swaps, which took the shovelware approach and streamlined it by just getting assets and chucking them together into a mishmash of junk, and same as the sort of scummy types online, use other brands' presence and characters to try and take the money and run. Woo-hoo-hoo. Oh, hi Flying Spider Rope Hero Adventures in Loco City.
2013 ended up seeing the generation shift as the Xbox 360 was replaced by the Xbox One, and the PlayStation 3 was replaced with the, can you have a little guess? The PlayStation 4. I wonder if they're going to carry on that naming scheme going forwards.
The Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 both launched around the same time, but Microsoft had a bit of an image issue. I really want to cover this in depth in a future episode, but suffice to say,
people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity, it's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360, that's your message if you don't,
like
it?
If you...
On this generation, however, there was a new thing to consider, something that was also becoming apparent to PC players. This is where we're going to shift a bit away from the hardware and get onto the platform itself. For a lot of people, they consider the console as just the console and that's it. Previously, this was absolutely true, but with the advent of content platforms, this changed somewhat. If you've been invested in Steam for a long while, you'll probably have hundreds of games available. If you want to return back to an old game because you have a new fancy graphics card and it used to chug, then woo, just look for it and play. But what if you abandoned Steam? As unlikely as that sounds, or you lost access to your account, which could be more possible, then you can't just dig out the game box and play it. You'll have to buy it again or go through the steps to try and get it back. But what if you went from Xbox 360 to PlayStation 4, which is what a lot of people did? Then the games are tied to an account you're not going to go back to again, unless you jump again or buy both systems. If you've become invested in an ecosystem because of the games you've bought and the add-ons along with the social features such as friends list, ding things for doing the things in games, this is where backwards compatibility comes into play more, as being able to access your older titles on the newer hardware can have advantages.
Will we see a way to end up moving your purchases from one platform to the other? Probably not, but it's nice to end up dreaming, isn't it?
Nintendo, of course, were being Nintendo, but they had suffered a bit of a knock from the Wii's successor, the Wii U. It was an interesting concept and had some games that took advantage of its features, but it didn't sell as well as Nintendo hoped, resulting in a down point for Nintendo. However, Nintendo decided to switch things up a bit with the Switch. Those of you who groaned at the switch things up line knew that was coming, and I do not apologise for that. The Switch became Nintendo's handheld and console offering, becoming the effective side piece for most gamers who already had invested into the PlayStation, Xbox and PC ecosystems. So where are we at now, and why am I saying this is all a circle? Well, load times have been creeping up for a while. From the early days of the CD being the way that we got the games into our eyes, load times started creeping up. Blu-rays had the capacity, but ultimately they had to be installed onto the console itself, meaning that the issue became the storage that it was dumped onto. On the PC side, SSDs, solid-state drives, became the preferred method of loading that data. Now with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series, this has become the way of storing your data, and load times are now in a more reasonable place. But where is the circle? Well, ultimately, we're almost back to cartridges. The Switch uses cartridges for retail games, consoles are using something that ultimately is rooted in the same idea as a cartridge. But where is this going to revolve again? Well, since the distribution system has changed, our new bottleneck is already there: internet connectivity. As downloads get bigger and as patches, updates, add-ons and operating system updates become more frequent, we're going to get to the point where the new loading times are the progress bar of a download. Even with fast connections, it can take a long time to get into the game.
I think one of the solutions we're going to end up seeing to the download issue is cloud gaming. We're going to get to the point where you're going to be playing a game that's streamed over the cloud through your subscription services such as Xbox Game Pass Ultimate or PlayStation Now, and that is going to be your way of playing the game before you fully downloaded it. But it's going to take a bit of time until we end up getting it to the point where it's a seamless transfer from one to the other. They're probably going to end up having more and more cloud services, offered. But again, that's still relying on your internet connection. I don't know whether or not we're going to end up having a point where Microsoft looking at the white space initiative again and trying to end up having their own dedicated lines just for Xbox traffic. We're always going to end up seeing, weird gimmicks supported for a time and then just completely dropped and abandoned. We're going to end up having backwards compatibility being really popular and then disappear again, and then being supported, sort of, but not quite, and then it's always going to come back round over and over and over again. As we move from formats, as we move from platforms, we're going to end up seeing backwards compatibility rise up and fall down again. Sony used to be amazing at it, and now they're not that great at it. Microsoft have ended up going from sort of shaky ground to absolutely fantastic to shaky again, and now they seem to be recovering slightly. It's too early to tell in this generation as what's going to end up being the more dominant platform, the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series. We'll just have to end up seeing what happens then. So there we have it. How basically base ideas end up coming back around over and over and over again, and bottlenecks will end up popping up, but we'll end up beating them. And I find that comforting, that we end up finding these challenges, and you know, developers, the publishers, consumers will end up figuring out ways to end up overcoming those bottlenecks and, you know, improve things and make it better. Thank you so much for watching. The original idea of this video was just literally going to be talking about the concept of a circle within gaming, of this bottleneck, of this constant thing where co-op will come back, and how backwards compatibility keeps rising and falling and all this sort of stuff. But it just sort of spiraled into a brief history of video games. I'd like to thank a Siamese cat twin for providing the little cover of Once in a Lifetime at the start, and also a big thanks to John Ellis, who will be appearing in like a second. Thank you so much again for watching. Bye-bye. Both of these systems ended up having a huge